What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 149. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Amslone, joined by the co-host, Will Porter. Will, how's it going today?
I'm doing great, Kyle. Man, we got some big news to talk about on the show tonight.
Yeah, I gotta say I'm a little tired today. Will, been trying to follow and keep up with everything going on in Afghanistan. I had to say it's developed far more rapidly than I think just about anybody thought possible, maybe including even the Taliban themselves. But the big news is that Kabul has fallen, the Afghan government has dissolved, and we're now at the point where it looks like the Taliban have won the war in Afghanistan. And America's 20-year now campaign, I guess, is forcibly coming to an end by the Taliban, and I guess that kind of means that the U.S. actually officially lost this war. But maybe we could talk our debate if that's actually the case when we get into the show here today. Will, everybody be sure to share the show. Me and Will are putting this one out early so the information is as fresh and current as possible. There's a lot of things that are developing in Afghanistan still rapidly. I think it's pretty unclear what the Taliban control over the country is going to look like, and there's a whole bunch of unreported details about how the situation in Afghanistan dissolved so quickly over the past week. But we'll be talking about what we know right now and, what we know has happened and some of early analysis on, again, America's longest war ending. So find the show at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of the show. You can find the video version of the show, and me and Will are going to have maps, videos, graphics. Really recommend that even if you're a usual audio listener, check out the video version of this show because we're going to have a ton of extra stuff to, maybe help add some depth to what we're talking about to help understand the reporting and just what the situation in Afghanistan is like today. So video version at YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble. Really recommend checking out one of the alternative platforms. We're having trouble with our YouTube account right now, so the show will be up there and it's kind of working, but we're definitely having our viewership suppressed there, and we're concerned about the longevity of our content on that platform. So please check out one of the others, Rumble or Odyssey. Subscribe to the audio version of the show somewhere, Spotify, iHeartRadio, anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. The show should be up there. And then you can support the show on Patreon or Subscribestar, or find links to crypto currencies in the show notes page. The last thing you could do to support the show is to get your CBD products at Paloma Verde. They have a great selection of high quality CBD products. They put their lab tester results right there on their front, their page, Will, so you can see that, that this has the exact doses that it says it does. The products work great for me. I'm always talking about their topicals, but I know, Will, you prefer a couple different products, so go ahead and tell us what you like from Paloma Verde and why.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, they do have some like salves and stuff that you can use for like topical external use, but I prefer the sort of capsules, the soft gels. They've got curcumin, they got a couple different formulations, but the one I like the most is the melatonin that helps you, sleep and wind down at night. I have some issues with insomnia, so those are great. They also have these very high dose oil tinctures that I really love. That's my second favorite product there, I think. So if that stuff sounds interesting, if you want to see their lab results, if you want to see educational resources, definitely go to palomaverdecbd.com and use the promo code PEACE to get 25% off your order over $75.
All right, well, let's just get into this, and I guess the best place to start is what happened over the weekend in Afghanistan. People were maybe predicting a siege of Kabul, but that really didn't happen. And from the time I record the show on Thursday, where I think I said 11 of the capitals, including Herat and Kandahar, had either fallen or were surrounded at that time. Now, essentially, the entirety of Afghanistan has fallen into the hands and control of the Taliban. So, what the hell happened?
Yeah, man, I would say this last week in Afghanistan has been extremely eventful. And these last few days, especially, I think will probably go down as pretty important in the country's history. This is kind of a turning point in the last couple decades, at least. And, I've gathered up a bunch of details and stuff about what's happened today. I may jump around a bit. So, yeah, definitely feel free to interrupt me or jump in whenever you want. But earlier today, on Sunday, when we're recording here, the Taliban, as you said, did move into Kabul. They took the city. They took the national capital. The Afghan government has collapsed completely. Most top officials, including the president, Ashraf Ghani, have fled the country, and the Taliban has taken over. They won this war, I think, in the most clear-cut way a military force can win a war, capturing the capital city and really most of the rest of Afghanistan, for that matter, in these last few days. And people have been saying, I think quite aptly, comparing it to the fall of Saigon in Vietnam. And this all happened sort of very suddenly today in the space of just a few hours. You and I, we've been covering the Taliban offensive on the last few shows. And starting maybe 2 weeks ago, they really began tearing through all these provincial capitals. And we discussed maybe the first, as you said, 5 or 8 or so on the show already. But by Saturday, that number had jumped to over 20 provincial capitals they had taken. And then today, Sunday, they now pretty much control 100% of Afghanistan. People can see this chart we have up on screen, as well as some of the graphics we've been showing that visually shows you just how much of the country they control. Afghanistan has 34 provinces, and some of the reporting I've seen puts them in control of 32 or 33 of them. There's only one pretty small regional capital that's left standing, the city called Bazarak, which historically is a stronghold of these anti-Taliban forces with this group called the Northern Alliance, which has been one of the more U.S.-backed warlord factions against the Taliban. However, by population, this town of Bazarak is very small. It's kind of a backwater. And, we were talking off air that if the Taliban wanted it, they could probably contest it pretty quickly. But otherwise, in addition to Kabul, the Taliban has captured most or all of the important cities over the last few days. Kandahar, the second largest city, Kunduz, Herat, Mazar Sharif, Jalalabad, Lashkar Gah, all of the major cities in Afghanistan, every single one. And again, people watching the video can see sort of just like the list of how many provinces have fallen just in the last week or two, as well as the dates on that chart. They can see just how quick that's all happened. It's right. Just in the space of a couple weeks.
And I mean, you could see, like the first dates are August 6th, August 7th, 3 maybe on August 8th, 1 or 2 on the 9th. And then over between the 10th and the 15th, it's been almost the rest of the capitals, again, with maybe one outstanding at this point. It's been I think, shocking and stunning to just about everyone, including the Biden administration, including, I think, for most part, the U.S. intelligence agencies. I mean, I think on Friday of last week, we had the Pentagon spokesperson, John Kirby, say that Kabul wasn't in imminent threat of danger, and yet it fell so quickly. And so, I mean, I'm sure there's still a lot of reporting left to be done here, but do we have any idea how the offensive was completed so quickly?
Well, it seems that the Taliban mostly marched into Kabul without a fight. Like there were some reports of explosions around the city when they were marching in there, but there didn't appear to be any big last stand by the government, to hold them back. Just as with many of these other cities, it seems like they just folded and fled pretty quickly. And in fact, there was even some videos going around showing these big convoys of Afghan troops. One of them, I think, it purported to show them going over the border into Iran. With all this U.S. made and supplied gear and vehicles and all this stuff. It was a big convoy of trucks. Now, it's kind of interesting. The Taliban actually claimed that they did not plan on taking Kabul today. They put out this big statement in Pashto saying that the police and the military in Kabul had abandoned their posts. And so they're saying that if people are watching the video version, they can see that's the convoy of Afghan troops fleeing out of the country. It's pretty despicable. It's kind of a just embarrassing show of fleeing. But anyway, the Taliban had put out this statement saying they did not intend on taking Kabul today, but that the security forces in the city, the government forces, had fled and abandoned their posts. And so they say their version of events is that they moved into Kabul so that they could provide security and prevent like looting and riots and stuff. Again, that is their version of the story. I think the Afghan government has a different take on that. However, the Taliban in that statement also insisted that nobody in Kabul has anything to fear from them. They're saying that, local Afghans, even ones who had worked with the governments, the Western governments, as well as foreign nationals, that they have nothing to fear, that they ordered their fighters to not bother people, to not enter anybody's homes. Now, I think the group has given these types of assurances before, and it has turned out in the past to not be true, where violence has occurred. But so far, I have not seen any major reports of major violence or reprisals, or a lot of the things that people have been fearing. It may still be kind of early to say, though. Like, this is all, within the first 12 hours of them marching into the city. Now, in terms of the Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, he had reportedly fled the country, first to Tajikistan, and I know you had said that later it was reported he was in Uzbekistan. However, with him now gone, the Taliban says that there will be no transitional government there. That like they just installed their new guy already. They declared a new president. This guy Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, and Baradar is actually a co-founder of the Afghan Taliban. He was at one point a top deputy to Mullah Omar, who's kind of like the OG Taliban founder and leader. And so this guy Baradar does have some pretty deep roots in the organization. And one interesting thing that I was reading about him is that apparently he was captured in Pakistan by Pakistani intelligence, the ISI, back in 2010, but that he was released 8 years later at the request of the United States. And they had said that they thought he might play some positive role in sort of the peace talks and the peace process there. So that is the guy they put in charge. And I do believe he did take some role in the negotiations in Doha and Qatar. But now he is apparently their the new president. I'm not totally sure what's going on with Akhundzada, who I thought was like the top Taliban guy. But I don't know. Maybe they just decided they want another political figurehead to be on the throne there in Kabul. But that's a lot of the details I had for like the actual fall of Kabul. I do have some stuff on like the evacuation efforts by the U.S. as well as sort of the Biden administration's response to all this. But I'll let you jump in with anything that you had on Kabul if that's about all I had there specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is happening all over Afghanistan. They reported happening at the Bagram Air Base, which also fell to the Taliban. That's a very interesting note that air base ends up falling so quickly after it was transferred to the control of the Afghan military. But, there's reports of prisoners being released from a lot of prisons around Kabul and Bagram. Thousands, I guess, of former Taliban fighters that are, I guess, current, even possibly Taliban fighters that were held captive have now been released. And you could see different video of it. You could also see video of a lot of equipment at bases that the Taliban have captured. Now, I have seen some reporting, Will, that suggested that while it looks like, that some of this equipment is probably functional, it may be missing like parts, components, and pieces, and that's why it got left behind, is because it wasn't running for whatever reason at the time. And so there's pictures with Taliban and Black Hawk helicopters. I'm not sure if any of these Black Hawk helicopters can actually fly, not to mention the fact that the Taliban probably aren't trained on them and can't maintain them long term, repair them into, there's specific parts that you need that could be tricky to do, and maybe they figure out a way. But at the same time, there are a significant number of weapons that have fallen into Taliban hands, including weapons that are, multi-million-dollar weapon systems. And so I guess maybe that's a good place to get into this withdrawal effort, and just how clumsy and sloppy it's been. Will, you would think that really the goal here for the Biden administration has to be, when they decide that we're leaving Afghanistan, make that announcement, the number one goal has to be not to have a fall Saigon moment, right? Like, you don't want to see your diplomats being helicoptered out of the embassy as the enemy closes in. Like, that has to be the one thing you want to avoid in all of this. And yet, self-fulfilling prophecy, I don't know how, but that's where they ended up. And so this is an unbelievable, some of the sites we've gotten today maybe yesterday in Afghan, I don't know all the times and stuff, but where on April or August 15th, the day that Kabul falls, we see smoke coming out of the embassy, the U.S. The flag, the American flag coming down over the U.S. embassy. We see Chinook helicopters moving hundreds of people out of that embassy, flights happening rapidly. And so I'll continue to show some of the videos in the background here as you're talking, Will, to get some of the images of what's happening and how just absolutely, I guess, unexpected this must have been for essentially everyone involved here, because it doesn't seem like anybody was really prepared to get all these diplomats out this fast. We talk about the Afghans too, who are behind, but and the fact that we're just deploying more troops, it seems like a huge train wreck. So let's talk about this withdrawal effort.
Yeah, man, I think I agree. The term train wreck is a great way to describe this. I mean, they had so much time to think and plan about how they would do this exit, and now they're forced to frantically trying to evacuate diplomatic staff out of the embassy in Kabul there. And I don't think they even made the decision to fully evacuate the embassy until Friday or Saturday. Like before that, they were saying we're going to have some kind of core level of staff there. But I think that really underscores just how little they understood the situation on the ground and how poised the Taliban was to walk right into Kabul there. Because like I think if they had known that, obviously they would have gotten their people out sooner. And so it really does. I think does highlight just like how clueless and how bad are, like despite the reputed great capabilities of U.S. intelligence, apparently they did not really understand the situation. They are right now frantically trying to get the people out of the embassy. I know one official had told CNN that they think they're going to have everybody out of there by Tuesday at the latest. And so apparently there are quite a few more people to move out. There's still some stuff to do there. That,
of the embassy or of the country, Will, because I had read some reports that made it sound like the embassy itself was closed at this point. I'm not sure. Maybe there's diplomat staff operating out somewhere in the airport, but is the embassy still like controlled and protected by the U.S. and there's still Americans in there?
I'm actually not sure. I think the Tuesday date was out of the country. I'm not 100% sure of like whether there are any staff. Because I know that the embassy, it's not just about evacuating people, because the embassy was, in addition to being a diplomatic facility, it was also a big like intelligence center. And so there's all kinds of like sensitive documents and computer hard drives. There's all kind of stuff that they have to figure out what to do with there. They kind of learned this lesson the hard way in 1979 in Iran, when like a bunch of sensitive stuff was taken by militants in Iran when the hostages were taken. So that's another thing they have to try to figure out there. I'm not totally sure whether that's all been squared away yet, but that's another thing they have to do.
Right. The smoke rising over the embassy today as some of those documents being burned is just one of the, I'm sure, the images that will be kind of perpetually shown to show how big of a calamity this was, Will. That, I mean, they weren't able to like tape these documents with them, or, I mean, they were just, I guess, having massive fires and burning a huge amount of documents, because there's a good amount of fire coming out of the embassy.
Yeah, that is kind of symbolic. Just like it also, I think, highlights just how unprepared they were. Because had they been more prepared, all that stuff would have been, figured out sooner. But yeah, they had to rapidly do all that, dispose of all this sensitive stuff. Because you don't want, there's some intelligence things you probably don't want falling into the Taliban's hands. Things that give away, I don't know, sources and methods or locations of certain positions, whatever. But now, in terms of the Kabul airport, obviously there's been a lot of chaos today in the city and a lot of people trying to get out. Now, the last I had seen, NATO announced that like all civilian and commercial flights out of the Kabul airport had been canceled, and that they're saying only military flights had been are being allowed. And I believe too, the U.S. military has now actually taken over air traffic control at the airport. I know I'd seen some reports that like there was really poor security there, that a lot of like the people who were supposed to be on detail had fled, the local Afghans, and so there was a lot of really chaotic scenes there at the airport. And it would seem that closing it to all commercial and civilian flights would have added to that confusion and chaos. Just like these clips of all these panicked people trying to get to the airport to get the hell out of Kabul. And I guess now a lot of them are going to be turned away, at least for now. I'm honestly not really sure exactly when they would be allowed to leave at this point, or when, a lot of these stranded people will be able to get out of there. I know there's some like, people, local Afghans who had worked in the embassy and stuff, they're being kind of prioritized. But there are also just a lot of normal Afghans who want to get the hell out of there, and I think they're kind of stuck. Right. However, to assist this... Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Did you have something?
I was just going to add, Will, I think one group of people that maybe isn't being talked about in Afghanistan is, as the U.S., has tried to, run its propaganda campaign as somehow, we're helping the people of Afghanistan. One of the things that they really did and promoted a lot of is, women in journalism and women getting into all these fields, which right. I'm not like saying that like Afghan women shouldn't be able to be whatever the hell they want to be. Like, obviously, right. That's my position on it. But at the same time, let's say that, you went to Afghanistan and you ran a program to train female journalists. Now they may be at heightened risk because of that. And even though they maybe didn't work for the U.S. or are in no way entitled to one of these special immigrant visas, nonetheless, they're at risk because of the U.S. occupation and nation building effort. And, the female journalist is just like one easy example to highlight. But I think essentially anybody who worked or benefited off of one of these Western NGOs, which the amount of like resources that the Western countries have poured into Afghanistan over the years, my guess is that there's a lot of people that may be at risk. Now, I mean, I know the Taliban are pointing out that, hey, they're not going to go that route and seek all these reprisals, but I understand why, if I were an Afghan citizen, I sure as hell, they're the government now, I sure as hell don't trust my own government. I damn sure won't trust the Taliban government.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they have tried to give assurances. Like some of the Taliban leadership based in Qatar, I think, have said that, like, we're not totally against women being educated. That was also an issue that came up in the peace talks, whether there would be female negotiators and stuff. And I think they did compromise on that issue a little bit. However, another thing here is that the guys in Qatar might believe one thing, but it kind of matters what the local commander guy on the ground says and thinks. If he decides he wants to carry out some kind of reprisal against a woman, I don't know how much the Taliban leadership would object to that or punish him for it. So they're still definitely, even though there've been sort of assurances that we're not going to do all these things to women, there might still be some concern there. Now, when it comes to the whole evacuation process for American diplomatic staff and civilians and stuff, the U.S. has now sent, I think, either 5 or 8 or several thousand troops from the Army and the Marines. I'm a little unsure about the exact number, because first they had said 3,000. And then on Saturday, I think they said it would be 5,000. That would be when they finally decided to actually fully clear out the embassy. But I don't know if those were two completely separate deployments or if they just revised the first one from 3 to 5,000. But nonetheless, there are several thousand troops, at least 5,000, at the embassy now, trying to, or that were sent to help the evacuation effort.
I have
mostly at the airport now.
I've seen it reported, Will, that there's 6,000 troops, and I think it breaks down to like 3,000 Marines, 2,000 from the 82nd Airborne, and then 1,000 from, I believe it's the Minnesota National Guard, but it's a National Guard unit. And so, at least from my understanding, that's the breakdown of who is in Afghanistan. And this, I guess, could be somewhat fluid, because I'm sure that when they say about 6,000, I mean, that could really mean like 10,000 different troops were in Afghanistan this past week, depending on how they're counting, like the flight crews and who's bringing in the C-17s to load up all these people on. Are they counting the mid-air refueling that's taking place for these planes, all the other air traffic control, maybe like the drone operator? There's a lot of flexibility in those numbers. And so if there actually are like 10,000 Americans at the Kabul airport or something, it seems kind of possible, but we really don't know, and we're just relying on reporting from the Biden administration. Usually it seems like kind of like, well, the public, they'll say like, we're sending an additional 5,000, additional 1,000 troops to Afghanistan. The actual reporting on who's going and how, what numbers from what unit, like the 82nd Airborne, that's coming from unnamed officials. And so it gets kind of a little bit harder to keep track on exactly who's in Afghanistan, what they're doing. Now, John Kirby, the Pentagon spokesperson, says this isn't a military mission, which, I mean, when you deploy 6,000 troops, you're doing a military mission. I mean, that's just by definition kind of situation. But anything else on the withdrawal, Will? What else do we need to cover here?
Yeah, I was just going to say that in addition to the troops who had been sent to help with the evacuation, and they're most of which I think are now at the airport, they did also deploy a couple thousand, I think, to Kuwait and Qatar. I think there were some Air Force guys and some Marines that were sent there, I guess, as just a precaution to just sort of be in the region. And now I have seen some people, like our friends, like anti-war types, pointing to these deployments and kind of suggesting that, oh, maybe this is a sign that, like, they're going to try to keep the war going. But I don't think that's the case. Like, I don't think these few thousand troops could possibly make any difference on the battlefield. And so in that regard, I think Kirby's probably right that this is not primarily a combat mission. Like you would need many more thousands, I think, troops you'd basically need a mini surge to really turn the tide at this point on the battlefield. So I do think that these couple thousand really are for the evacuation effort. And according to, apparently there was an official that talked to Axios, and they're saying that these troops who had been sent to do all this evacuation stuff, they are supposed to be out of the country by August 31st, which is what the Pentagon was saying previously about all the other U.S. troops as well, that they would get the withdrawal done early ahead of the 9/11 deadline. And so that is another sign to me that this is just going to be a temporary deployment for the evacuations. This isn't a sign that the war is going to keep going or something.
So there was an interesting statement that came out pretty early this morning, Will, because over the weekend, I think the message from the administration was essentially get to the embassy, get out of the country. from the U.S., and this was also the case for most other Western governments. And then I noticed sometime this morning, at least Mountain Time, so it might have been even around like noon Eastern Time, that the State Department had switched their position and instructed Americans in Kabul to shelter in place. And so I'm not sure if there are Americans in Kabul, how many Americans there are in Kabul, if they're at risk of being taken, like hostage by the Taliban or something like that. There are certainly a lot of Western press in Kabul. Richard Engel, I think, is reporting from Kabul. I'm not sure. Maybe he's at the airport or something like that. But I see the BBC, Al Jazeera English, several other outlets, all English outlets, all reporting from Kabul. So I'm not sure what exactly the Taliban are, allowing in terms of, foreign media to continue to report, or if there's a risk of them or people who maybe worked at NGOs, contractors who are like working on some project, maybe not necessarily directly for the Pentagon, their families, question mark, if they could get out of the country, stuff like that. And so do we know if there are or how many Americans are still in the country?
I had not seen any specific numbers on that. I did also see the alert telling that, the Americans who might be there to shelter in place, but I didn't actually see a number about that. Right. I did notice that, in terms of the foreign media coverage, I was looking on Reuters, their wire thing, and just to see if there were any photos of, just the Taliban rolling into Kabul. And there was a weird lack of them. It seemed like maybe they had gotten a lot of their reporters out of there. I know oftentimes they'll rely on local stringers, local Afghans to take those photos. And maybe they just are, preoccupied right now with trying to, them and their own family's safety. But I noticed there was sort of a weird lack of images, at least, coming out of there.
Right. And then on the Afghans who are applying for special immigrant visas and trying to get out of the country, I saw Richard Engel doing a report, which seemed kind of dangerous, where he was showing all these people who had claimed to work for the Afghan government and now were trying to get out of the country. And it seemed like he was maybe giving, if somebody were looking to carry out reprisals, maybe he was giving somebody a hit list. So that didn't seem like such a great idea to me. But anyways, it seems like there are a lot of Afghans who worked for the U.S. in some role. Everybody likes to focus on the interpreters, and certainly the interpreters are people who work for the U.S. and I don't necessarily want to see them get hung for that. That being said, they were working with the U.S. military, where there were people who were built the fences around the U.S. bases. They're, people who clean the toilets and cut the food and stuff like that. Those Afghans are also being left in. They're worried about their safety and they want to get out of the country too. And so I haven't seen any numbers on how many Afghans have got to leave, how many more Afghans want to leave. There's certainly a number of Afghans who are being left behind. I'm sure, especially right now with all the flights going out of the Kabul airport, that there's got to be tens of thousands of Afghans in other regions of the country that haven't been able to make it to Kabul. And probably, now it's harder to get through Kabul to the airport since the Taliban control everything. And so, with the way the U.S., and maybe we could talk about what our take is on, the withdrawal here in a second. But do we know how many Afghans are leaving, how many are left behind, and where the hell they're all going?
Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, about this. And I think that's really driving some of the fear and sort of chaos in Kabul right now, is people just have no idea what their fate is going to be. I know the Canadian government, they said last week, by the time people hear this, I think, they had said they're going to try to help 20,000 Afghans to get out of the country. That seemed to be kind of just an arbitrary number they chose. They didn't give any kind of timeline for that. They didn't say exactly how that would be done. And given just the intensity of the recent hours there, I don't think they're really going to be focused on that too hard. It seems like, they're trying to get their own people out. Canada had sent their own special forces unit to try to evacuate their own embassy. But so there has been some talk about what to do with these Afghans, but it seems like they've kind of been not the main priority for, the Western governments there.
Yeah. I want to say one thing I have a real concern about, that the Biden administration is completely unprepared to take on the number of Afghan refugees that are coming. Do they have beds, clothes, food, places set up for these people? Are they just going to kind of drop them off in Qatar and let them linger? I mean, I'm sure you saw the reports, and they're kind of not a whole lot of details exactly what's happening, but there's definitely concerns about contractors, I think Filipino contractors who worked for the U.S. in Afghanistan ended up in Dubai, and now they can't get back to the Philippines. They're just stuck. So how many people is this going to have to that are going to be stuck, like in various, maybe a couple thousand will be in Turkey, a couple thousand will be in Qatar, a couple thousand will be in the Emirates, and they're just kind of gonna end up stuck there and not really have like a home. And if the refugee visa process doesn't go very quickly, it doesn't seem like the Biden administration is all that concerned about it. I mean, these people could end up languishing in some pretty terrible situations for, months or years to come. If there isn't a lot of like scrutiny and, emphasis placed on this, that something has to be done. And again, this is just the people that we've so far gotten out, not to mention that there's a significant number of people in Afghanistan who probably want to leave, who are probably very influenced by and, bought into the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan and that government, who are now afraid for their lives. So, Will, I don't know, what were your thoughts on the withdrawal? Because, I should just go to this tweet by Dan DePetris, because I think he really nails this when he says, everybody complaining on Twitter about humiliating and horrible the U.S. withdrawal should direct their inquiries to the Pentagon, which had 18 plus months to prepare an adequate retrograde and evacuation plan. If you just gloss over this, you're playing politics. And I mean, it does seem to me, Will, that there's something really wrong here, that we are completely unprepared for something that should have, had a year and a half of preparation. It almost, in a way, resembles when Trump was trying to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria, and it didn't seem like the Pentagon wanted to play along. In fact, there were U.S. officials in the week leading up to it telling the Kurds that, we're not leaving, and then we end up, announcing we're going to leave. Well, Trump ended up being like staying by that tactic where essentially the military just drugged their feet. And so I mean, I'm kind of speculating here, but it really, you have to wonder, Will, if there was a possibility that, maybe the military and the State Department really thought in the end Biden would keep troops in Afghanistan. In that by them, if we have 20,000 people in Afghanistan, we have to get out. That's a reason to stay. And so that's a way that they could cheat the system and kind of force Biden's hand, or so they thought. And maybe that's where we can now get into what Biden has done, where, again, this withdrawal, Will, has been completely botched, and Biden deserves almost all the blame for that. Some should go to Trump because, if he had maybe been a little bit more firm and organized of a president, well, he probably wouldn't have lost the election, and then then he maybe could have, completed this withdrawal on time in May. But even from that, it was clear, like during his administration, that we didn't seem to be on a path to have everybody out and everything ready by May 1st. And so, maybe some blame belongs there too. But as far as it goes, Will, there was I think a question I asked Danny Surgeon about a month ago, which was, will Biden get steamrolled? And while, we couldn't say yes, Biden's not a man of fortitude. And so there was real questions about that. So what are your thoughts on how kind of Biden has handled this?
Yeah, now in terms of the first part about just like, I think it is very possible. Like this would only make sense. I think it would sort of like explain some of these like this anomaly of them seeming to be completely unprepared. I think you might be right. There might be something to this idea that they thought that they would be able to sort of slow roll this withdrawal, or maybe turn it back and make it not happen. Because it seemed as if they had all this time to prepare and they kind of didn't use it. It seemed like maybe some people in the Pentagon thought that this wouldn't actually be happening and that they wouldn't actually have to do this. But then at some point they realized, crap, we actually have to start scrambling to get this in order. And that was maybe just in the last couple of weeks that they've even been thinking about that. Now, so that's that part. And then when it comes to the Biden, the administration overall, as well as Biden himself, his response to this, I've actually been kind of impressed with it. I don't think they've had the worst kind of reaction to all this news. And the administration is getting slammed pretty hard in the media right now. They are kind of being blamed for like handing the country over to the Taliban. But Biden and his people seem to be kind of holding out against that. Like Biden himself, I think, is actually on vacation right now. He's not even supposed to be back at the White House until next week. But not long before Kabul actually fell, he put out this statement pretty forcefully defending his decision to withdraw troops. Like one part of it, he had said, quote, 1 more year or 5 more years of U.S. military presence would not have made a difference if the Afghan military cannot or will not hold its own country. And an endless American presence in the middle of another country's civil conflict was not acceptable to me. And, I thought that was pretty good. That's about like as good of a thing as I can hope for him to say against this. People blaming him for basically giving the country over to the Taliban. And then also you had the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. He was doing sort of the media rounds today. He went on like 3 or 4 different mainstream shows to talk about the fall of Kabul. And pretty much all throughout that, his argument has been that we cannot stay in Afghanistan forever. And that's sort of like, we have to leave at some point. And this was basically inevitable. And so I thought also he was kind of taking sort of the right approach. There's some things that you could criticize. But like, for example, Jake Tapper of CNN was basically saying that, like, why shouldn't Biden be blamed for this supposedly hasty withdrawal? And I just think it's such a ridiculous question. Like, we could have slowed down this withdrawal for another year or 2 years, make it August 2022, 2023, and this would still happen once we leave. Like, the Taliban is still going to roll in and take things over. Nothing that we do is going to change that. And the people in media just don't seem to really understand that, like, beyond permanent occupation, there is no other outcome here. 20 years of arming and training and $2 trillion spent here, like, if that can't do it, then, staying another couple months is not going to make the difference. Now, I think people like Jake Tapper do make a good point when they say that this withdrawal was very poorly planned, as we've kind of been saying. That, like, it is kind of weird that they would pull out this tiny force of like 2,000 or 3,000 guys that Trump left there, only then to send in another 5,000 or 6,000 for this evacuation. Like, clearly that is a sign that this was not thought out very well. If they're, pulling out guys only to resend them back in. And then there's another thing, too, that the administration has kind of been arguing that I think very much falls apart. Blinken has kind of been trying to, like, portray this as a victory, as this whole thing. He was, like, trying to insist that, like, there is no comparison to the fall of Saigon in Vietnam because that, we achieved our goal of getting the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks. And, forget the fact that al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden had fled Afghanistan in the first few weeks of fighting there. And then it took us a decade to actually find him, like, 100 miles away in the country next door. And then we stick around for another 10 years fighting the Taliban and doing all this nation building stuff. Like, clearly that was a massive failure. So Blinken's attempt to try to sell this as any kind of success, I think, is absurd and totally falls apart. However, I do think that the administration is sort of taking the right approach when they're saying that, like, a lot of the stuff was inevitable and that staying a couple months, a couple years longer could not have, prevented what we're seeing now in terms of the Taliban, taking over.
Right. Now, well, I guess there is maybe something to the fact that, let's say if Biden decided to put like 100,000 troops in the Afghanistan, it probably wouldn't have fallen on August 15th. Right, like right. That would have made a difference. Now there may be some U.S. Young men and women coming home in boxes because of that decision, but at the same time there was probably something Biden could do to slow the Taliban advance. But at the end of the day, as you're pointing out, that this wasn't ultimately going to change the fate of the war at all, and the Taliban probably were going to go on an offensive after the past year and a half of having signed the deal with Trump and expecting the U.S. to leave, and so it's not like the Taliban wouldn't have been taking territory anyway. So I think that's a fantastic point. I think definitely some praise has to go to the Biden administration. It is the most one of the more difficult political decisions to make in Washington. Now this does have apparently support of the 70% of the American people who want to end this war. However, it ending in the way it did and sticking with it through this is something that you gotta give Biden credit for. I don't know, Trump couldn't follow through with it in Syria, so it is something that you kind of gotta say that Biden must be committed to this policy because it is going to be weaponized against him heavily. And I guess he's willing to accept that, and that this is going to be something that rightfully is kind of a black eye on his record, but far more there are a lot of people in Washington who are more responsible for the situation in Afghanistan than Joe Biden, who I mean, while he isn't like necessarily anti-Afghan war, I mean, even under the Biden administration he didn't want to surge, but it's not like like he didn't want to wage a drone war and special forces raids in the country. You know, he just wanted to turn the Afghan war into the Somali war, which in a way is better. You know, I would rather just bomb a country, you know, once or twice a month than, you know, 6,000 times a year and have 30,000 troops deployed to that country. But, you know, that you're asking me, you know, if I'd rather be shot in the head or the heart. It's not really a good option either way. So there's a lot of problem with the arguments that the Hawks are making. One thing that the Biden administration has been putting out, Will, that I thought was really unfair is that they're placing a lot of blame on the Afghans for this. Now, look, something happened in Afghanistan that's going to be reported in the coming weeks, that where we really understand how the hell the government lost this much territory this fast. You know, they say we trained 300,000 Afghan troops. I could guarantee you, Will, that there wasn't 300,000 Afghan troops a couple weeks ago. You know, the roles of troops were far shorter, and I'm sure, like in Iraq, you know, the number of troops who were not only on the rolls and showed up for their jobs, but were also willing to fight for parts of Afghanistan that, you know, weren't their homeland areas, you know, the Uzbeks fighting now the Uzbek parts of Afghanistan. That probably wasn't going to happen. And so, you know, the numbers shrink that way more. But when you look at just how poorly the U.S. has executed its nation building effort, just look at the reports from the U.S. Inspector General for the Afghan War, John Sopko. Time and time again, he says that, you know, the Afghan state can't stand without the U.S. Now, I don't think he predicted that it was going to fall before the U.S. even finished their withdrawal. I'm not sure anybody really thought that it would be done by this point, but at the same time, there definitely were a lot of people who were aware that the U.S. built the Afghan nation very poorly, and it's definitely not fair to, you know, place all the blame there when a lot of it falls on, you know, the 4 U.S. administrations that have attempted to carry out this war for the U.S. So, Will, anything else on that? Or, you know, maybe I'm just kind of curious on your overall thoughts about this. There's, you know, a lot of concern. We could kind of get into what the Hots are saying after, but I mean, you know, I'm interested in like kind of what questions you're going to be looking for answers to in the coming week. If you have any overall thoughts on like the Taliban takeover, on the Afghan government, the Afghan army apparently not it just like doesn't exist anymore, or maybe in one province. Who knows? That could even at this point be more of an ethnic militia. There's still some like Afghan government negotiators in Qatar. Do they have any role power? So any of those questions that you have answers to?
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, I am surprised about how fast all this happened. Like, you know, there was this intelligence assessment that was cited by Reuters earlier this week. It was an anonymous Pentagon official who provided it, but he had predicted that Kabul could fall within 90 days. And, you know, even some people were saying that, you know, that is seen as too soon, but it ended up being more like 3 or 4 days. You know, not 90. And so, you know, like I figured they would take Kabul at some point, but I definitely did not foresee it coming that fast. And just the fact that the Afghan government collapsed and folded so quickly does, I think you're right, just really highlights what an absolute fiasco and waste the last 20 years have been. You know, like, yes, some criticism certainly can be made of the Afghan government. There's really bad corruption among the military there, all the ghost soldiers, you know, which may have contributed to the perception that the military would have been stronger when, you know, half the guys are just like, you know, corrupt fake soldiers that only exist to enrich certain commanders. However, it's also true that our leaders have lied to our faces for 2 decades straight about this, about their confidence in the government and the military there. They've been saying all along that, you know, they think they can build this lasting force. But no, it's very much like Vietnam. They knew this thing was unwinnable, as we can see from, you know, like the Afghanistan papers, just like the Pentagon papers show. They knew about how this was completely unwinnable. But for, you know, for more than a decade, they've been telling us that it's not unwinnable, that we can, you know, build some kind of lasting force there. You know, like, how is it possible that after billions and trillions of dollars blown on this, we're talking entire yearly salaries of people like us, middle-class schmucks like us, blowing years of our life of, you know, of labor on training and arming this Afghan military? How is the government this unprepared? How is that, you know, how is the Pentagon not coordinating with them to heavily fortify Kandahar and all these major cities as soon as the U.S. withdrawal begun? You know, everyone knew this was coming. Like, how was the Taliban able just to waltz into every city like this and they just completely folded? So those are certainly some outstanding questions that I have of just how this happened militarily. Certainly, I think there are a lot of outstanding questions about the refugees and what's going to be done for them. Because when you're talking refugees, it's not just, getting them a plane ticket. They are completely dependent and vulnerable now. They don't, it's not just moving them to a new country. They don't speak the language. There's a lot of things that, a lot of resources you have to expend to help these people. And it's really not clear at all what's going to happen there. The Canadian government's talking about it, but the U.S. really hasn't. But yeah, there have been some, hawks still saying, I see Bill Kristol, even, unexpectedly Marianne Williamson calling to, suggesting we should still keeping troops in the country. But like at this point, they really should just be arguing, that Afghanistan should be annexed as the U.S.'s 51st state, because this is a recipe for permanent occupation. If after 20 years they still aren't ready to sort of stand on their own, if we can't get them ready, then they were never going to. And this thing is ridiculous and impossible. So, short of either occupying Afghanistan until the end of time or launching a genocidal bombing campaign where you kill every last Pashtun male over the age of 12 in Afghanistan, like what we're seeing now sort of was inevitable. Like, we've been kicking this can down the road by staying, but this is always what's been coming.
Yeah. The thing about staying till the end of time sounds absurd, but there have been hawks who talked about, look, the U.S. American, Native American, I think, the U.S. Indian Wars, whatever they're called. We could do that to 250 years. And so essentially, they're openly calling for at least a cultural genocide. Like, they do not want the Pashtun, people to exist as they currently are. And, there are a lot of people in the U.S. government who are essentially eugenicists and would rather them die than live the way that they choose to live. And so that's something very disturbing about this. A couple, questions just to add to yours, Will, is what did the Afghan government actually do in the recent weeks? Because last week, or I think maybe even the end of last week, Thursday or Friday, they changed the commander, both their Afghan National Army and their special operation, their commando forces. What happened to all those forces? Did the commanders flee? Where are they? All these leaders. So that's a big question I have. In a way, though, I have, maybe part of the answer to these questions is that Ghani kind of recognized that this was a losing battle, and rather than fighting a bloody and months-long civil war, just decided that he was going to be the Afghan Gorbachev and just kind of let the thing dissolve and the Taliban to walk in. I mean, one of the things that seems pretty striking is, especially after the fighting for Kandahar, Lashkar, Herat, Marzi-Sharif, these are some cities that seem to have fighting, but a lot of these entire provinces, so not just like, this city, it's not like, Lansing, Michigan decides to call it quits. The entire state just calls it quits without even fighting a real battle. And this happened seemingly in areas that had, significant number of Afghan minority populations, the Tajis, the Uzbeks, the Hazaras. And so, exactly what the hell happened? Maybe the Taliban cut deals, or maybe there were just such serious problems with the Afghan National Army that they all left and the people weren't ready and didn't have militia form. I don't know. There's a lot of possibilities, but that's a very interesting question. One of the things, Will, I guess, where if you're somebody who, conducted this war, I think, kind of the thing you have said all along is that Afghanistan isn't Vietnam. And, one of the ways that this war isn't supposed to be a complete failure is, you don't want your weapons falling into the enemy hands. Well, not only are the weapons going to the hands of the Taliban, but the Afghan government are driving them over the border of other countries like Tajikistan, which has a relationship with Russia, or over the Iranian border. So, yeah, those are real big humiliations. The fact that you couldn't get the people out who worked and who, trained with the U.S. all these years, all these people in Afghanistan, they're like flooding to the airport trying to get out of the country. That's a real problem, that you weren't ready for it, that you're having a fall of Saigon moment, but without a decent interval. And in fact, the everybody says the fall of Saigon is the U.S. losing the Vietnam War. Well, the U.S. troops were actually out of Vietnam 2 years before the fall of Saigon. This was something that was pointed out by the Reuters Pentagon reporter Idris Ali online, was that this is even worse. That, this is, essentially that this is happening as the U.S. still has troops in Afghanistan that were evacuating our embassy. And so, Will, one question here that I have for you, and then we'll have some fun ripping on the Hots. The last one I got is, did the U.S. lose this war? Because the consensus is that there's no way the Taliban could ever beat the U.S., but it kind of seems like we're being chased out of the country.
Yeah, man. I mean, I think by most metrics that you could possibly count, yes, this war has not been a success. We did lose. I mean, the only thing, like Blinken was saying, you can sort of point to the fact that, we got Osama bin Laden, but again, 10 years after the fact.
And in Pakistan.
Yeah, in the country next door, not even there.
A U.S. ally.
That's right. Yeah. Apparently, according to Seymour Hersh, at least, we didn't even find him by our own doing. It was just a Pakistani intelligence guy walked into a CIA office and said, "Hey, I know where bin Laden is." So It's not like you can't even attribute that to the war. Finding him, rooting out his network or something. So in most ways, every conceivable way that you can measure a success of this war, it's not. We haven't met it. It's a failure. And this is just like one of the most spectacular ways that it could have ended, of them marching and taking Kabul and the rest of the country before we're even out of there. And so, I think it is really, unfortunately, a really humiliating moment. And there are some sort of shades of, definitely the fall of Saigon, also shades of when the Islamic State overran Mosul and, all that American gear was left laying around. That could potentially be a problem for years to come, depending on whose hands that falls into. So, I mean, in every conceivable way, this is probably the most spectacular way this could have, gone unfolded.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I was 11 years old at the time, Will, but pretty much for everyone 20 years ago, if you told them it was going to end this way, it would have seemed unbelievable for them. Sure. But, this is where we're at, and there were heroes all along: Patrick Coburn, Gareth Porter, Scott Horton, and the whole team at antiwar.com, plenty of leftists, like the whole team at Code Pink, Medea Benjamin, who the whole time were really fighting against this. Eric Margulies, Scott Horton has a list of so many people with great names: Matthew Ho,
Danny Surgeon, of course,
Danny Surgeon, Daniel Davis, so many people who were really right about this. But for so long, Will, so many of the people, Bill Kristol, Matt Spoot, essentially anybody who's been elected to the office, maybe other than like Ron Paul and Barbara Lee, have essentially been wrong the whole time about Afghanistan. And so when now you have HOTS like let's see. We'll start with this one from Mitch McConnell, who said last week that we need to step up airstrikes to slow the Taliban advancement. And then Eli Late saying, "I predict we will be reading future memoirs by Biden experts explain how they pleaded with him not to do this in Afghanistan. Too late. Time to go public was more than 4 months ago." People that really seem to think that there was an option here for Joe Biden where the status quo was something that could have been upheld. They look at what happened over the past 18 months, 2 years, where there hasn't been an American soldier who died in Afghanistan since I think February of 2020. And to them, that either reads as we could keep our presence in Afghanistan with either no Americans dying or with minimal Americans dying. And so there's tons of people out there talking about the low cost of the Afghan war. Now, it's not their loss that life that's the low cost, but what do you think about this idea that we could have just kept fighting this war at a low cost?
That's nonsense, because I think the major reason that the Taliban had withheld its attacks on American soldiers is because Trump signed a deal with them saying we're getting the hell out of the country. That they said, okay, fine, we'll give you guys your year or whatever to prepare to leave, and we won't attack U.S. or coalition forces. But that was the only reason why the occupation was so-called low cost, was because the Taliban were just sort of waiting. They're in this holding pattern, waiting for us to leave. And so short of that, I guess the Hawks could argue that, yeah, let's sign a deal with the Taliban and then renege on it and just stay anyway. But I think that would then trigger new attacks and new reprisals on American and Western forces stationed there. So the only reason that there was any pause in those attacks was because we said we were leaving.
All right, this next one we could just laugh at, Will, but it's one of our old foes, Mark Thesson, who says, if South Korea were under this kind of sustained assault, they would collapse just as quickly without U.S. support. There is virtually no American ally who could defend themselves without us. This is maybe the most absurd thing I've seen on Twitter in the past couple of days, and I mean, we're going to get to Marianne Williamson next, but the idea that, you know, the South Korean military is no more capable or interested in defending their country than the Afghan National Army and the Afghan government was is completely absurd. You know, South Korea, like, they have their own military and could probably actually defend themselves in North Korea without the U.S., but I think there is a little bit of the hot saying the quiet part out loud here, right? Of, you know, we're supposed to be going places and, you know, we support them, but it's so they can support themselves. I mean, a lot of these people are Republicans who live by the whole if you teach a man to fish, you know, versus if you give him a fish narrative. And yet you have Mark Thesson coming out saying that, hey, we need to give every country all over the world a fish all the time, and we have to maintain this endless empire, or else the whole world is going to fall apart right away. So that's a rather big stretch on that one. Anything to say about Thesson, Will?
Yeah, I mean, that is just like you know, ideologically, that is just like a radically imperialist like stance to have. That like there's no power on planet Earth that could even possibly contend against, you know, potential enemies without American help. That like, I don't know, at what time in history has that ever been like something that people believe, that like this single power is you know, integral to every other country's continued existence? It's insane. That kind of ideological backing is a recipe for global military empire, and it makes sense because Mark Thesson is exactly that. You know, he's just that kind of hawk.
All right, so next up we have an unlikely duo, Bill Kristol and Marianne Williamson, who, at least in the recent Democratic primaries, I always thought she came off a little bit tipsy on stage, but most people thought she came off as one of the least hawkish members. You know, Kristol goes with the old "we could have kept troops in for a low cost," and Williamson says there's a rare instance where I support U.S. military presence, but in this case, given the Taliban's treatment of women, I agree. And so, Will, this is the old narrative that, you know, we have to stay in Afghanistan for feminism and to save the women. And she put out quite a few tweets in the past couple of days about this and defending this, even though she's gotten ratioed and hammered a few times. Now, Will, I had in the past couple of months Scott Spalding and Danny Scherzen on the show to talk about Afghanistan. They're both Afghan war vets. Scott was a Marine who gave out the condolence payments, and of course Danny's the West Point professor. He was an Army major. He commanded forces in Afghanistan, right? Like, he knows this. These guys know this country, and they not laughed, but they completely dismissed the idea that we were there for humanitarian rights reasons. Both of them brought up the Botsy boy or whatever they do, where they dress the boys up like young girls. They have them parade around in front of some tribal elder leaders, and then they rape them. This has been a constant problem for the U.S. They brought up the U.S. alliances and support for warlords like Dostum, who is known for sodomizing people with a rifle. I mean, just the worst human rights abusers. And not to mention, well, the U.S. has killed tens of thousands, if not 100,000 Afghans, including tons of innocent civilians. I mean, just in the past, year, there's 30 pine nut farmers, just people doing their job who are blown up. No consequences for the U.S. I mean, not that the Taliban won't come in and won't do some bad things. I don't know how heinous they're going to be. I think the Taliban are trying to portray themselves as maybe being a little bit more reformed than the last time that they came to power. And I mean, in some sense, there are groups that have adopted less militant and less radical positions. I think you could look at the IRA and FARC as maybe some more common examples, but also even Hamas in Gaza, who went from being essentially just an insurgency/terrorist group to, they're almost a government force and military in Gaza. It's asymmetrical in a way, but at the same time, it's far more representative of like a governing body than just a crazy militant ideological group that goes around and carries out war crimes all the time. And So I think it's a very complicated issue, Will, and it's not like a black hat white hat issue like they like to all pretend. And it seems far more to me like the Taliban may be slightly worse than the government that we were keeping in power, but you also had to figure that we had to kill an awful lot of innocent people to keep that government in power.
Yeah, that's right. And I think your point about the warlords is very well made. Like, a lot of these warlords did not care any more about women's rights or feminism or, protecting young boys for that matter than, these terrible Taliban bastards would. Not to mention a lot of the warlords that we had sided with, people all know these iconic photos of U.S. soldiers patrolling poppy fields. A lot of these guys were like heroin dealers and, all kinds of unsavory people that we got into bed with in Afghanistan. And so the idea that the Taliban is just so much categorically worse, like, I think that is sort of an exaggeration. And yeah, they have given these assurances about women. I guess we'll have to wait and see how serious they are about that. It certainly is the case that, like, when the Taliban was the government, when they were previously the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan in the late 90s, we did see that they were sort of like responsive to some international pressure. I mean, they did ban poppies in the late 90s because they were going through a bad famine. They wanted aid. And so the Taliban does sometimes respond to some international considerations. And so I don't know, perhaps that will be a trend that we see pick up. Assuming they do, hold on to Kabul and actually continue to be the government there. I think it will be a very symbolic thing for the Taliban to be back in charge on September 11th, on the 20th anniversary of the attacks. And so it seems like that is sort of in the cards now.
I think that's one of the most powerful points, Will, is that in the lead up to 9/11, like in 2000, 2001, I think even in 1999, poppy production in Afghanistan decreased greatly, and I think in 2000 was almost nothing. Now, I'm not like a kind of guy that really thinks that the government could win the war on drugs, but if you're the kind of people that enforce rules like the Taliban, maybe you can make it so that, you're doing all kinds of other destruction to your society. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's like a utilitarian good, but if your goal is to not, have red flowers in your country, you cannot have red flowers in your country. And if, Taliban seeking international recognition stomped out poppy production. And Danny Shershin came on the show and he made the point that, look, in the lead up to, 9/11 and before that, when they're seeking international recognition, they weren't saying that they had to stop executing women in public. Nobody cared about Afghan women. The only time anybody cares about Afghan women, other than people in the anti-war movement who want the U.S. to stop blowing them up, is when the war is about to end and they have no other excuses. They only care about women as a last resort. And it shows that nobody, even like in the mainstream media, even mentions all these women in Kabul who trained with the U.S. and Western NGOs and who are, maybe have made themselves as targets, becoming a little bit of like female icons in Afghanistan. They don't seem like they got any priority on getting out of the country, or anybody's all that much concerned about them. And it's one of those things where if you're really concerned about protecting them, then the thing to do at this point is just to leave. And also the fact that if you wanted to protect women's rights from the Taliban, you're going to kill some women, just like the Taliban would, innocent women, with your bombs and stuff like that. A couple more real quick, Will. This was one of my absolute favorites. It is the terrible Senator Ben Sass, the unmitigated disaster in Afghanistan, the shameful Saigon-like abandonment of Kabul, the brutalization of Afghan women, and the slaughter of our allies is the predictable outcome of the Trump-Biden doctrine of weakness. Will, what do you think about the doctrine of weakness?
Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of a ridiculous amalgamation there. Like, I think in a lot of other ways, people would, contrast. I mean, you and I, of course, have pointed out many ways in which Biden and Trump are very similar, but their similarities are more about, how hawkish they've been, toward China, for example, or Iran. Those have sort of been like their doctrinal similarities. The idea that they're, similar, they have a doctrine of weakness just because both backed the withdrawal is absurd. I mean, Biden, I think, was sort of like his hand was kind of forced into this. So I'm not sure how, ideologically committed you could say he was to it. But yeah, I don't know. I just think it's an absurd, trying to lump those two together.
All right, so last up here, Will, and then we'll wrap up. And I've seen so many people put this out. I have an article, but just real quick, the safe haven myth. Everybody is saying that America is in more danger. Terrorist attacks from Bill Kristol to Boris Johnson. This is the big talking point they have. The worry that terrorist attacks are going to have. Biden, of course, says we're going to maintain our over-the-horizon capability, so we're going to continue to bomb Afghans in the future. Now, Will, in a lot of ways, you know, this is obviously stupid, but at the same time, there is a little part of me that goes, boy, at least 100,000 Afghan civilians have died in this war. If there is some Afghan who's really mad and who happened to get himself on an airplane out of Kabul, it's not possible, but I'm not quite sure that our concern maybe needs to be directly from the Taliban or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I just think this idea of the entire safe haven myth that Afghanistan somehow is uniquely situated to, you know, produce terrorist plots in the United States, it's just an absurd myth. I mean, like, Afghanistan, as Scott Horton often argues, is effectively exile. It's a very remote place to be. It's not like there's some magical terrorist portal right into New York City from Afghanistan. And in fact, the 9/11 attacks themselves were planned largely from within the United States itself. And, you know, there was a cell in Hamburg, Germany. A lot of this didn't really, like, I don't know, Afghanistan didn't really uniquely provide any role there. I mean, yes, the Al-Qaeda had taken some, like, safe haven in the sort of, like, ungoverned tribal areas in the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which, by the way, remain pretty much ungoverned, and, you know, militant groups can operate there if they'd like to. And so, like, I don't know, just the fact the U.S. occupation did not make the Afghanistan any less of a safe haven. And I think, as you have argued too, like, you know, if anything, it radicalized so many of these young men who might now be motivated to get on a plane to New York, or, you know, so I think you're right.
All right, well, I guess that's where we should wrap it up. We've been going for a while here. Everybody, we are going to put this show out as soon as everything is ready. So hopefully all the information we just went over is as current as possible. But be sure to subscribe to the show, because there is going to be tons of Afghan coverage here. You know, not just this week, but and I'm sure the months to come, as we follow up on things on what's happening to all these Afghans leaving the country. What are the Taliban doing as they take power? What happened to the Afghan government and Afghan army? What's happening to the U.S. equipment that ended up in that country? And continuing to take on the narrative from the warlords, who are going to continue to, I think, try to drive the U.S. towards war. You know, we got to remember Iraq at the end of 2011. In a way, we had no choice in a different sense, but, you know, we had no choice and had to leave. But a few years later, we were back, Will. So there's still a lot of fighting to be done on this issue, but hopefully, maybe for the first time since me and you were in elementary school, there's not going to be U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and there is a feeling about that it is, you know, like a little bit of a step in the right direction. So we'll tell people where they can find your work.
Sure, yeah. I'm a staff writer at RT. It's where I do most of my writing. If people want to find that, they can go to my Twitter. It's where I kind of collect all my stuff, and that's at the Will Porter, and that's basically a one-shop stop.
I'm at Kyle Anzalone _ on Twitter. We're adding a ton of new subscribers to our video platforms, YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble. If you are subscribed on YouTube, think about checking out and subscribing to one of the other channels, just in case we catch a little ban or something like that. You never know, and I don't want anybody to miss the content, especially when you know, things develop as fast as we had developing right now, where you know, in a few days, you know, the show and the content isn't going to be quite as fresh. So be sure to subscribe so you're getting the information as it comes out. And we'll be back with more shows this week. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Kyle. Bye, everybody.